you miss me? I've been out of it comatose, but the depression is.
Hello and welcome to Controlled Burns, the weekly hobby list podcast with me, your host, Andrew Burns, or Slow Burn from Wildfire Gaming. I'm back this week to continue the ongoing series that we have with discussing my top 100 artists of all time. And so today we're on part four of this discussion. So we are going to recap the bottom 60 entries now before we get into the uh, next 20. So this is entries 40 through 21. And then whenever we return, probably next week to this, we will finalize the list with the top 20. So if you've listened to the series up to this point, I want to thank you for doing that, and I hope that you found it interesting and you found my reasoning unique and my picks varied because that is kind of how I'm looking at it, I guess. And it's been really fun for me just to even look back on the artists that make up my top 100 and kind of determine what those are and just sort of reflect on my lifetime as a music fan. So it's been a really fun project for me, and I'm looking forward to getting into it with you this week. So before we do that, just a reminder that Controlled Burns is a weekly hobby list podcast with a particular focus on lists and topics related to video games, music, TV, and film, as well as other hobbies and aspects of pop culture. If you're interested in writing into the podcast and having your comments or questions read on air, like we had last week, you can write into the podcast at controlledburns with an ES at gmail.com. Okay, so again, we're gonna do just a kind of a quick rapid fire of the bottom 60 spots on the list. So let's kick it off with number 100, which is of course Martin O'Donnell, the famed Halo composer. 99 is Restless Heart. 98 is Camper Van Beethoven. 97 is Jane's Addiction. 96 is The Evening Rig. 95 is The Cure. 94 is Green Sky Bluegrass. 93 is Mitsudo Suzuki. 92 is James Newton Howard. 91 is M83. 90 is Iggy and the Stooges. 89 is Austin Wintory. 88 is Jay Mascis. 87 is Billy Joel. 86 is Florence and the Machine. 85 is Takeshi Hama. 84 is Tadayoshi Makino. 83 is Yasunori Mitsuda. 82 is Stephen Malkmus and the Jicks. 81 is Waxahachie. 80 is Bill Elm and Woody Jackson. 79 is Darlene Love. 78 is Bon Iver. 77 Julia Jacklin. 76 Atomic Tom. 75 The Velvet Underground. 74 Sharon Van Etten. 73 Ryan Adams. 72 Robin. 71 Swearin. 70 The Who. 69 Brett Dennen. 68 Ashley McBryde. 67 The War on Drugs. 66 Free Cake for Every Creature. 65 Ashley Monroe. 64 Adam Scorpa. 63 Michael Giacchino. 62 Melandrew. 61 Don Henley and the Eagles. 60 Matthew Dennis. 59 Yutaka Yamada. 58 Rosen. 57 Junichi Masta and Goichinos. 56 Gary Clark Jr. 55 The National. 54 Banner Pilot. 53 Masayoshi Soken. 52 Metallica. 51 Better Oblivion Community Center. 50 Madonna. 49 Tsukasa Saito. 48 Justin E. Bell. 47 Brandy Carlisle. 46 Aerosmith. 45 Dr. Pez. 44 Always. 43 Ben Howard. 42 Can R Gao. And 41, where we left off last week or a couple weeks ago, was Rage Against the Machine. So that's our bottom 60. Now we are going to get into the next 20 entries on the list, starting with number 40. And that is Yoko Shimomura. We've kind of talked previously about how Nobuo Uematsu, of course, who we haven't gotten to yet on the list, but he was kind of the composer that kind of defined the end of the 20th century, particularly for video games. And I think it can be argued that Yoko Shimomura is the composer of the 21st century. She has just a legendary body of work stretching back to the 90s, to be fair. In the mid 90s. Well, really, she got her start even in the early 90s because she was one of the main composers on Street Fighter 2. So, yeah, obviously, that, I mean, that goes back before I was even born. It's really incredible to think about just the longevity that she's had and the heavy hitters that she's had too, in terms of Japanese releases. So from there, she went to Breath of Fire, Live Alive, Front Mission, Super Mario RPG, Parasite Eve, Legend of Mana, Kingdom Hearts, which is probably what she's most notable for, Mario and Luigi, Radiant Historia, Final Fantasy 15, Streets of Rage 4, and Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope. And then now she's kind of come full circle back to arrive at Street Fighter 6, which she was a composer on. Um, you look at that history, you look at that kind of lineup of things that she worked on, you really could make the argument that she's has become the most prolific video game composer in the world, certainly in Japan. And I think it's safe to say, like I mentioned earlier, that her work on the Kingdom Hearts series, and she's been credited on every single entry in that series to date, which is something to say considering how many there have been, how many spin-offs there have been and whatnot. I think that's become her greatest critical and commercial success, and with good reason, considering many of the iconic pieces of music that accompanies that series, and just what it takes from obviously the massive Disney body of work, the Final Fantasy body of work, and then just the original compositions that I would argue have become just as iconic as many of those. Um, but for me, really her work on Final Fantasy 15, which I already think is one of the most underrated video games I've played in a number of categories, including music, uh, really stands out to me. I really like what she did with that Final Fantasy 15 soundtrack. But regardless of the context, just the genuine emotion that she's able to evoke out of her melodies is, I think, her greatest calling card. And no doubt the greatest contributor to her legendary run and ongoing success. So with that, Yoko Shimomura, number 40 on this list. Number 39 is the indie band Wilco. So if you're like me, you grew up, or at least came into your own as a music fan during the 2000s and 2010s. It's likely that Wilco impacted you in some way. Um, for sure, their greatest claim to fame is their renowned 2002 release Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, which was an album that was kind of immortalized when their label Reprise Records dropped them as they were getting ready to release it. Uh, but what was crazy about it was that they actually gave them the rights to the album for free, which they Wilco promptly posted online. This is back in 2002, so it wasn't exactly the newest days for the internet, but it was still a fairly novel concept. I think a lot of people were still kind of coming into it at that time. Certainly, I didn't really have great access to the internet way back in 2002, but they kind of made that album an early legend, kind of beckoning in the streaming age. I mean, it really was kind of ahead of its time in terms of that. Um, but even when so it definitely had, you could argue an outsized sort of level of cred and fame as a result to that little story there. But even whenever you kind of cut through all that and just get to the music itself, I still think it stands out as one of the greatest albums of that time period. It's just filled to the brim with some of the greatest songs I would argue ever written. Stuff like Poor Places, Pot Kettle Black, Ashes of American Flags, and Camera. Um, so that was just an incredible album. But it wasn't like their only great album either, because they had a number of acclaimed albums to their name since then. Sky Blue Sky was a big one. The Whole Love, I remember being really big, right around the time that I was first getting into Rolling Stone. And then, Star Wars released in 2015. I remember reviewing it for the East Texan. I was the editor of that outlet back then, and that was an amusing little name for that. It actually came out the same year as The Force Awakens, Star Wars movie, but had no relation to Star Wars at all. But it was a great album. Um, but in terms of just my favorite Wilco moment or track, I think it's Impossible Germany from Sky Blue Sky. Uh, the guitarist for this group, Nels Klein, he has just an unbelievably great guitar solo that just plays that song out, and for an extended period, like half the song I want to say is made up of that solo, and particularly as it just kind of hits its crescendo at the end when the rest of the band comes back in. It's just an all-time great song and an all-time great guitar solo. So with all that in mind, Wilco, number 39 on my list, is a truly great band. Number 38, we have, and I hope I'm saying this right, but it's Ramin Djawadi. This is an Irish-German composer that really uh, had a big claim to fame in the 2010s. If you're a fan of this series, you might already know what I'm talking about. But he was already kind of making a name for himself in the late 2000s. He scored, I guess the biggest thing that he did kind of in the build up to what he was really his claim to fame was the Iron Man film, the original Iron Man movie from 2008. He also did Clash of the Titans. He did the 2010 version of Medal of Honor video game. But it was 2011 when he kind of became immortalized forever in the annals of music history when he got the job to score the legendary Game of Thrones series, to which he devoted the next decade of his life. And, you could really kind of ongoing still to this day, really. Uh, the Game of Thrones theme itself is definitely one for the ages. I'm sure if you looked up a list of like the greatest TV series themes or intros, that would be ranked extremely highly, if not number one. But as a big fan of the series and just the art of great composition, I've always appreciated Jawadi's eye for writing both emotional but easily recognizable themes that are capable of subconsciously tipping the audience off toward what's coming. I think probably the most notable version of this is in the infamous Red Wedding, and I won't go into spoilers on what happens there in case you haven't experienced it for yourself. But the music is actually written into the story of that moment, and I think that it's done masterfully by Jawadi there. And his skills in this area are so strong, in fact, that he actually, when he was tasked with writing the music for Cersei Lannister's infamous burning of the Sept of Baelor in season six, he actually had to write a completely new piece of music without utilizing any previous themes because they didn't want to tip off the audience into what was actually going on there. And then what he wrote was like this gothic masterpiece that was so brilliant they actually used it as Cersei's theme for the remainder of the show. So anyway, without question, I think that piece of music is his single greatest masterwork. It just brilliantly builds the tension to the show's, I would argue, greatest climax. But he nearly matched it again a couple seasons later for the final stand against the dreaded Night King in the Long Night. That's another really great piece of music. But um, even after the show's kind of infamous ending and its fall in the public eye as a result of that, you really shouldn't overlook the equally brilliant music that he has continued to produce for the ongoing House of the Dragon Game of Thrones prequel series. So whether you've seen the show or not, and I highly recommend that you do, take a quick listen to "Funeral by the Sea" from season one, and tell me if you think that he's lost a step. I mean, it is also a phenomenal piece. So obviously, I'm a huge Game of Thrones fan, and I'm just really impressed by Ramin Djawadi. I mean, it's an incredible body of work that he has produced for that series and continues to produce for House of the Dragon. So I got to give him props here at number 38. 37 is another composer. It has some similarities to Raymond Djawadi, and this is Jeremy Soule. Um, I kind of find it fitting to have them next to each other on this list. They have similar soundscapes, they have a similar rise to prominence in terms of when that happened. They share these kind of evocative Nordic sensibilities in their masterworks, which obviously was Game of Thrones for Djawadi, and it is The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim for Jeremy Soule. Um, and, obviously, with that being said, Soule's work was just kind of burned into the brains of millions of people worldwide during the early 2010s, accompanying countless Skyrim adventures. And really, his work continues to accompany the adventures of many people in Skyrim to this day. So prolific and long tailed is that, one of the greatest and most replayable games ever created. But um, one thing that's kind of interesting about Soule is comparing him to Djawadi is Djawadi's work really only goes back to the late 2000s. I mean, you could go back to that Iron Man movie in 2008. That was one of his earliest pieces of work. But Souls actually goes back to the mid 90s, kind of around that Yoko Shimomura period. He worked on actually as a sound tester on the legendary Final Fantasy VI, though none of his work actually made it into the final version of that game. But he did move on to fully score Secret of Evermore the next year, and that was kind of his first big project. And that kicked off a prolific career that included the likes of Icewind Dale, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone back on the PS1, The Elder Scrolls Morrowind, and Oblivion, and obviously Skyrim, Neverwinter Nights, SOCOM series, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, Company of Heroes, Prey, Metal Gear Solid, Peace Walker, and even World of Warcraft, among countless others. So, if Yoko Shimomura is kind of the composer from Japan during this period, I think you could argue very successfully that Jeremy Soule is the composer for the West across that same time period. Um, and there's no telling how many more classic scores he would have penned in the next decade had his work continued. But unfortunately, he was wrapped up in several sexual misconduct scandals in the late 2010s. And then he did include allegations of rape, and so he's kind of scarcely been heard from since. And it's just left behind this legendary legacy that, like so many others, is threatened to be marred by controversy. And we're going to get into a couple other individuals on the list here today that kind of have a similar status here in 2025. But number 36, here's a band that is kind of back in the headlines right now because they are about to be honored at the Kennedy Awards. But this is Kiss. Number 36 is Kiss. And so this is a big entry on the list because depending on your perspective, there's a chance that Kiss's high marks here kind of is the biggest threat to legitimacy and my approach to making this list, which of course we've discussed previously, is focused on the peaks of these artists' careers rather than like a full career retrospective. And so I recognize that it would not be unfair to argue that more bad music can be ascribed to Kiss than anyone else on this list. Obviously, the career was very long, going all the way back to the early 70s. And you could argue that the majority of it persisted perhaps long after it should have. But like I said, this list is built off of peaks rather than a full career retrospective. And if you're a fan of the 70s heyday of hard rock, there's hardly denying that Kiss's run of hit records over the course of that decade is worthy of acclaim and celebration. Now, I recognize that some of those albums were uneven. You had albums like Dress to Kill and Rock and Roll Over, for instance. They were kind of filled with fantastic and mediocre tracks in equal measure, to be fair. But when they were operating at their peak, as they did often during that period, they had standouts like Destroyers, Detroit Rock City, Rock and Roll Over's Mr. Speed. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find a rock group that could do it better, even in the heyday of the genre that was the 70s. And the band also knew how to put on one hell of a show. And they had the chops to back up their kind of on-stage personas and theatrics. And this was immortalized through the legendary Alive album from, I think, 1975. And that helped popularize the live album as a concept. And it still stands as one of the best and certainly most successful ever released. And even, it's like I said, it's easy to kind of look down on their career after the 70s, which is fair in many cases. But even long after they were past their heyday, they could still bang out the odd standout or two. Check out All for the Glory from 2009 Sonic Boom, for instance, and tell me it doesn't sound every bit as good as their 70s best. So, I again, it's mostly kind of focused on the 70s stuff, but just for the history of this band and for their high watermarks, rather than you look at them in terms of that rather than you know their lowest points, then I think you'll agree that Kiss is certainly one of the most iconic and I would argue best hard rock bands from the 70s. So there they are at number 36. Let me know what you think about my reasoning there or my criteria because I understand that might be questionable for some. Moving on to a more modern rock band. This is the number 35. This is Catfish and the Bottlemen. So this is I kind of drew some similarities here with Catfish and the Bottlemen with Ben Howard, who was on the previous section of the list. They're a British artist that was introduced to me by my wife during the weeks leading up to our first meeting, which I kind of discussed in that previous episode. But they have a very different approach to musicality than Ben Howard. Yeah, Ben Howard is kind of this eye darkened singer songwriter full of depression and logging, quite frankly. Whereas Catfish and the Bottlemen, they're a pretty bona fide band of like bad boy rockers that wouldn't have been terribly out of place in decades past. Maybe rubbing shoulders with Kiss back in the '70s. They have a bit of that pop punk edge that Reagan is really into, and that I kind of find revolting, quite frankly. But there's enough behind the eyes and fingers of Van McCann, who's the front man of the group, and just the rest of the band. It kind of makes me sit up and take notice, and obviously keep coming back for more. The album that she sent during right before we met was the band's debut album, The Balcony. And it's a remarkably consistent album for a new band on the scene. It's just 37 minutes, so lean and mean, just like I like, and featuring what have become some of my favorite songs of all time. The oddly relatable and rollicking 26 is a standout for me for sure, but I'll never forget listening to that album, just sitting on my little twin bed that I had at the time, and hearing that coda of Fallout for the first time. And it just instantly elevated what would have already been a great song into one of the best I've ever heard. And even now, whenever it comes on, I have to kind of have to stop what I'm doing and sing along. I just think it is so infectious and so unbelievably good. Including whenever I was kind of taking my notes on this very group for this podcast. I kind of the same thing happened. Um, Now they've only put out a couple of other albums, and actually have been on a pretty lengthy hiatus. But they actually earlier this month they actually played their first show in many years, and so the door's open to kind of continue on what has already, in my opinion, been a brilliant legacy. So, number 35, Catfish and the Bottlemen on this list. 34, we have Hitomi Sato, another composer. Obviously, if you listen to previous episodes, I've already given mad props to several composers that have been linked with the Pokemon series. But I can't stop there because we haven't discussed the greatest one yet, and that is the unsung hero. That is Hitomi Sato. She doesn't quite have the tenure of Junichi Masa and Goichi knows that we discussed in the last section, but she joined the team as a game designer as far back as Pokemon Crystal on the Game Boy Color, which, as a fun fact, is actually the first Pokemon game I can remember being advertised in real time on TV. I had Gold, Silver, I had Red and Blue, but I remember actually seeing the commercials on TV for Crystal, and that was kind of interesting. So Junichi Masa and Goichi has continued to handle composition duties for the first three mainline generations of Pokemon, but they brought in Sato for the DS era, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, which are definitely some of the greatest soundtracks in the series. And then she continued to bolster that resume with a run of much of Pokemon's best musical work: Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the Black and White games, on through Pokemon Sun and Moon, which just particularly and brilliantly captured that Hawaiian atmosphere so well. Thanks, I think, in large part to Sato's Evers. And so she continues to work on the series today as a composer. She was on the 2022 dual releases of Pokemon Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet. And that makes her work, quite frankly, some of the rare aspects of the latter that actually performed at a reasonable rate. So you got to give her credit there. She was maybe the MVP of the studio in 2022. If you listen to Dr. Pez's Pokemon, which we talked about him in the last section as well, but listen to his Diamond and Pearl medley, or some of TPR's arrangements and A Scroll Through Johto, which is includes the gold and silver music, but take a listen to Global Terminal, which actually she wrote herself, and did not exist in the original uh, Gold and Silver, but was written for Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Um, those are really great examples, kind of modern looks at the brilliance that this woman has brought to the franchise, and hopefully will continue to bring for years to come. So, Hitomi Sato, number 34 on this list. Number 33 is Paul Simon, with noted collaborator as obviously Art Garfunkel as Simon and Garfunkel. Few singer-songwriters, I would argue, have had the tenure or run of legendary albums and songs that Paul Simon has. It starts with his. That's actually Garfunkel was actually his elementary school friend, which is incredible. And they just made this brilliant duo in the '60s. bolstered to prominence on the strength of their seminal hit, The Sounds of Silence, which obviously would be featured prominently to an almost comedic degree in the infamous coming of age tale that is The Graduate from '67. And you'll actually see parodies and memes of the song's usage mirroring its use in that film to this day. And it's often by younger fans who don't even understand the full context. Like Reagan, for instance, my wife, I just showed her The Graduate last month. She'd never seen it before. But as soon as it started playing The Sounds of Silence, she was like, "Oh my gosh!" And I was like, "Yeah, this is where it comes from." But just as Simon and Garfunkel's fame and output was hitting its critical peak, 1970 with Bridge Over Troubled Water, they split and they pursued their own careers. And so Garfunkel himself, as a solo artist, has some great stuff to his name. But I don't think there's really any question that Paul Simon was the songwriting force behind the duo's success, which he was able to utilize to great effect as a solo artist through fantastic recordings that he released after Simon and Garfunkel. His self-titled sort of re-debut in 1972 was really great. But his most notable release, probably alongside a toast of talented African artists, was 1986's Graceland, which won him no end of accolades at the time. And so I still think that Simon and Garfunkel's work continues to be the most standout of Paul Simon's career. But I do love Graceland, and there's no denying the infectious energy of that record. And its title track in particular, I think I really love. So because I wanted to kind of factor that in as well, I went ahead and just gave Paul Simon the top billing here, with Simon and Garfunkel as a noted collaborator. But either way, however you want to look at it, just an incredible body of work this man has produced and written. Certainly one of the greatest songwriters of all time, and I would argue one of the greatest artists of all time, at number 33 on this list. So number 32 here. I don't think this is going to be a controversial take. Number 32, I have Fleetwood Mac. And you talk about well, you want to start kind of talking about the career of Fleetwood Mac. I mean, they had one of the most storied and complicated careers in music history, to the point where literally list of Fleetwood Mac members, it's its own Wikipedia page on top of the main band page, which is hilarious. So it was originally formed in 1967 by Peter Green, but he was not in. Was he in? Yeah, he was not. I don't think he even continued with the band because they're really the only common clause between like the hardcore blues version of the group and the '70s lineup, which had, of course, had Stevie Nicks and Christine McVie, and really the version of the band that everybody thinks of is Fleetwood Mac. That was Mick Fleetwood. He went back to the original, and I think John McVie, the bassist, went back to the original. So yeah, like I said, it's this version of the band that is the most well known. It featured one of the greatest runs of albums like of all time in the mid to late '70s, with '75's Fleetwood Mac, '77's Rumors, and '79's Tusk. And it's really that run that earned them a spot in this list, and their status as one of the greatest bands of all time in the eyes of many. Rumors, in particular, has understandably stuck out in the eyes of most as their masterwork. It's actually one of only 10 albums ever released with more than 40 million in confirmed album sales. But I really liked Tusk a lot. It was a double LP. It was a follow up to Rumors. I definitely think it gives Rumors a run for its money. It's got these slow burners like Stevie Nicks' Beautiful Child and Christine McVie's just gorgeously understated over and over. But actually, if I'm being honest, it is actually an outtake from Rumors, which is Stevie Nicks' Silver Springs. That stands as my favorite song in their catalog. So if you want to give that credit to Rumors for that, then fair enough. But regardless of where your favorite songs lie, no amount of uh, controversy, betrayals, and dramatic and public battles, which could probably fill multiple seasons of Game of Thrones-esque television, has managed to tarnish that output of fantastic music, which just kind of serves as a stark reminder uh, that what matters most at the end of the day is making great music. And that is certainly what Fleetwood Mac managed to do for the second half of the '70s there. So number 32 on this list. Number 31, very different artist here. Number 31 on this list is Dead Mouse, the DJ and EDM specialist. Um, Now, Kiss isn't the greatest credibility killer of this list. I know that Dead Mouse will probably stand as one of the biggest obstacles for some to in terms of what I have here. But for those of us that were there for Dead late 2000s, early 2010s heyday, his status is nothing short of legendary. This was a time when EDM and house music was spilling out of the clubs and dance floors and finding its way into the mainstream with DJs like Lady Gaga and Skrillex kind of becoming these overnight pop stars, while some of the more established hit makers from years past, like Usher and Britney Spears, they were kind of transitioning to this new synth-based sound on the heels of a throng of electronic-infused hits. And Deadmau5 did not reach the commercial heights of some of those people, but um, for those that were really plugged into the space, I think he hit a particular critical high that in some ways went unmatched. I mean, you look at the output of killers that this man put out in the span of half a decade. You had the cool hypnotic tones of Strobe to the just in your face bash of Ghosts and stuff. Just this incredible build and release of Right This Second. The melancholic synths of There Might Be Coffee. Just the amount of emotion and variety produced with such a limited palette, obviously, is stunning. And just wrapped all that is Dead Mouse just kind of had this evocative, frankly borderline trademark infringing look that just became a symbol for the genre as a whole. And so for those reasons and more, Dead Mouse, he's not only my favorite EDM artist, he's one of my favorite, obviously musical artists of all time. And I just look back on that peak of his career so fondly. Is a really, like I said, it was a time for music where I was just so into it and just expanding my musical horizons so significantly at that time. And Dead Mouse was a huge part of that. And I gotta give him props. And you know what? He's still making music today. So, it's not like he's some over the hill guy that isn't in the space anymore. He's still there, still making great music. So, he's number 31 on this list. Number 30. There's some similarities, I suppose, to Dead Mouse. But there's also some differences. Number 30 is Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails. And you could put Nine Inch Nails itself in this spot. But I wouldn't quite go that far because of the career that Trent Reznor has had outside of that project, and particularly with noted collaborator Atticus Ross, who is a member of Nine Inch Nails at this time, but they've also done a lot of stuff outside of that. So if you haven't checked in since his kind of hard industrial peak in the early 90s as the frontman and all-around mastermind behind Nine Inch Nails, which is an iconic band of that time period, and they had those seminal releases, Pretty Hate Machine and The Downward Spiral. You'd be forgiven for missing out on just the incredible range that this all-around music auteur has developed in the decades since. And that isn't to downplay the greatness of those records, because you'd be hard pressed to find a better fan of, songs like Head Like a Hole from Pretty Hate Machine than I am. But the music that has come from this man and his now longtime collaborator Atticus Ross since that period is really astounding. It's just a litany of great music as Nine Inch Nails that is extended well into the 21st century through releases like Hesitation Marks and Add Violence, to just an equally impressive run of film scores. And it started with 2010's legendary The Social Network, on to 2011's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Then there was the show The Watchmen, and they scored all of that. And then my favorite, they scored Pixar's Soul, which was just an incredible piece of art, my favorite film of all time. And their work was definitely a critical piece of that. Every one of those releases is varied and evocative and really extraordinary. And just to think the mind behind those early forays into industrial rock is also responsible for the stirring piano-led swirl of emotion that is Epiphany from Soul. It's nothing short of remarkable. So for that impressive variety and just scope to his work, I've got to give Trent Reznor props here at number 30. And I think that that kind of variety is going to be a big part of many of the entries going forward, but not necessarily number 29. Number 29 is somebody that just does kind of one thing and does it extremely well, and that is Seat Headrest. It's another indie rock group that I recognize, might not be for everybody, but they have absolutely mastered the sort of, I don't know, unhinged burnout approach to rock and roll that just really works for me. And few have ever matched it on the level of Car Seat Headrest. I was introduced to the band, which actually began as a solo project from the frontman, Will Toledo, at the turn of the century in 2010. But I got introduced to them in 2016 with their album Teens of Denial, which, put very bluntly, includes some of the greatest music I've ever heard, much less released this century. It's got this jackhammering swagger in songs like Destroyed by Hippie Powers. That's really only topped by the oddly melancholic, heartfelt, and yet triumphant duality of Drunk Drivers and Killer Whales. I just love that song so much, and that album. But impressively, the group has released four more albums since then, including an album this year, The Scholars, marking kind of a 9 year run during which Toledo has unveiled this iconic alter ego called Trait, which is kind of unique. If you've seen him, you know what I'm talking about. But at the end of the day, some groups just kind of click with you on a level that few can. And for me, Seat Headrest has done it on a level few have ever replicated. So they're number 29 on this list. Number 28, though, is another band not really known for a ton of variety, but just really nailing what they set out to accomplish. And that's Velvet Revolver. They're truly, yeah, my brother and I was actually talking about this the other day, but they're truly one of the most perfectly 2000s things that there ever could be. Just a brilliant continuation of the hard rock edge of Guns N' Roses, sans Axl Rose, mixed with the angsty and kind of unhinged sort of sway of Stone Temple Pilots frontman Scott Weiland. And the result is every bit as great as it sounds like it would be, with Slash's guitar theatrics and just the unstoppable motor hum of the rhythm section that is bassist Duff McKagan and drummer Matt Sorum, who I still think beats the crap out of his drums like nobody I've ever heard. And then, of course, with Scott Weiland, kind of his sort of drug fueled sway, like I said, on top of all that. Frankly, like most projects led by members of Guns N' Roses, there wasn't a ton of material that was actually released under the Velvet Revolver label, just two full-length albums, 2004's Contraband and 2007's Libertad. But what was released was of the utmost quality, particularly in the case of Contraband, which for my money is every bit as strong as Guns N' Roses' best work. Just filled to the brim with straight bangers. They had Slither, which was kind of their most iconic song, but also just this raucous big machine and the this unhinged ode device that is Superhuman, which with Superhuman, I think that is to date the greatest riff that Slash has ever come up with. And if you're a Guns N' Roses fan, you know that is something you can't say lightly. So they may not have been long lived in real time. Scott Weiland was fired by 2008, and Slash and Duff ultimately obviously reunited with Axl and Guns N' Roses in 2015. But for me, for my music, my rotation, Velvet Revolver is rocking as hard as they ever did 2 decades later. And I listen to them all the time. I love them so much. I love Contraband in particular. I think it's one of the greatest albums of all time. Velvet Revolver. I mean, it's the thing. Like that style of music was so popular in the 2000s, and you could even argue that Velvet Revolver was kind of trend chasing at that time, but they just did it better than everybody else. And that's kind of something that you could say something similar for Guns N' Roses when they came onto the scene in the mid '80s. So yeah, I just love Velvet Revolver. I think they're so unbelievable. And if you haven't listened to those albums or haven't given them much of a shot, especially if you grew up around that time, you really should go back and check it out because I think you'll get a kick out of it. But number 27, here is one of the most famous groups, maybe the most famous in music. Number 27 is Coldplay. And I got a lot to say about Coldplay. So you look at Coldplay's history and their discography. I mean, few bands have come out of the gate as strong as they did right at the turn of the century. The 2000 LP, Parachutes, and it had this kind of seminal dual hits of Yellow and Sparks, which are two songs that are so universally appealing. They're actually still the band's top two artists on Spotify, or top two songs on Spotify all these years later. And that's saying something considering the run of hit singles and albums that this band produced over the next decade. You had 2002's A Rush of Blood to the Head, which had Clocks and The Scientist. Just absolutely massive songs at that time. 2005 had X and Y, had Fix You, which was just inescapable at that time. 2008's Viva La Vida had its title track, and also Life in Technicolor. And then 2011, which was coming out around the time that I was getting ready to graduate from high school, was Milo Xyloto, and that had Paradise and Every Teardrop is a Waterfall, and it just on and on and on. I mean, they just have an unbelievable lineup of hits. And while these are the releases and tracks that define many of my experiences with the band during their kind of perceived heyday, the reality is the band has actually never been bigger than they are right now. They literally hit their peak listens of more than 98 million monthly listeners on Spotify as I was researching them for this podcast. That actually makes them the number one band in the world on Spotify. They're the sixth highest artist, but the five above them are individual artists. So they are the number one band on Spotify, and that's above like the people that you could think would be at the top, like Taylor Swift and Drake and Kendrick Lamar and Ariana Grande. I mean, Coldplay is above all of them by millions of listeners. And I recognize that you could argue that at least some of the reason that they're hitting this peak right now, you could attribute to their recent viral moment, accidentally outing a cheating tech CEO at a recent concert. That was iconic, and everybody got a kick out of that. But the reality is, they've actually been in the top 10 artists on Spotify since I discovered that list existed last year, and I check on it periodically just because I think it's interesting. And Coldplay is always in the top 10. And I was amazed when I found that out. I was like, that is unbelievable that Coldplay is that high. They're the number one band in the world. But, it kind of makes sense when you think about how incredible their back catalog is, which is surely the lead contributing factor to their long lasting success. But I'd argue their continued ability to just, they have this knack for merging optimism and just undeniably catchy hooks, which was illustrated when I listened to their 2024 album Moon Music last year. And I was just very impressed by that album and just how catchy it was, and yet how positive it was, and I could see how this would be the music that the top band in the world would be creating. You just listen to some of the choice cuts from that album, like "Man in the Moon" or "Good Feelings." And just try to tell me that they don't have anything new to offer in a time when pessimism and negativity runs rampant. So, for all those reasons, Coldplay is number 27 on this list. I love them. I know that it's kind of popular to sort of hate on them these days, but there's a reason. I'll tell you this: there's a reason that they're the number one band in the world, and they're not the number one band on this list, but number 27. Hey, not too bad. So, Coldplay at number 27. Number 26. Here's another icon. It's actually David Bowie. So I've kind of an interesting introduction to David Bowie. It came from a fairly unlikely place, which was a playlist of his works that was curated actually by Bono of U2. And it was in an early 2010s issue of Rolling Stone. They had famous artists compile playlists of their favorite songs from their favorite artists. And the first one on that lineup was Bono compiling a 15-song set from David Bowie, and it was an awesome line. I had never heard of like any of these songs before because this was back when I was really, like I said, really getting into music and hearing pretty much everything for the first time. And just that lineup of songs for David Bowie just blew me away. It was like Space Oddity and Changes and Starman and Life on Mars and Lady Grinning Soul and Ashes to Ashes and Warzawa. And I just remember being blown away by the variety on display. It was on a level the likes of which I had never experienced before. And frankly, I'm still amazed all these years later about how the variety that David Bowie was able to produce over the course of his career. You listen to something like The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and just this impressive grandiosity that it has, and then listen to something like Low, just the enigmatic hues of that album, or the '80s pop sheen of Let's Dance, or the kind of the doomsday groove of Black Star, which was his farewell record in 2016. It's like listening to completely different artists every single one of those albums, and all of them will be really good artists, by the way. And I think that kind of contributes to why various versions of David Bowie were significantly less commercially celebrated. You had your Starman period where everybody loved that, or Changes, changes. Everybody loved that. But where were they for Low? Where were they for Black Star? Quite frankly, it's interesting that he has like these highs and lows as an artist that I mean every artist does to a degree, but somebody as famous as David Bowie, you don't usually see such massive swings like he did. But honestly, I honestly think that several of these kind of off the beaten path gems, like Teenage Wildlife from 1980, Scary Monsters, or Sound and Vision from Low, kind of stand apart as his best work. And so, it's very interesting. He's such a fascinating artist. Certainly one of the most interesting guys that's ever been like a huge pop star. He's unpredictable, dramatic, constantly creative, truly one of the artist luminaries of our age. And quite frankly, I can't help but thank Bono for putting together such a great collection of diverse cuts all those years ago to kind of get my foot in the door. into experiencing his greatness. So, David Bowie, number 26 on this list. He's just absolutely brilliant. Number 25 is not quite as varied as David Bowie, but what they do extremely well, and that is Muse. And they are fairly varied, to be fair. Many other artists on this list, my introduction to Muse actually came at the hands of Guitar Hero, and when they included Knights of Sidonia off the now legendary Black Holes and Revelations album as a high-profile late-game challenge, Guitar Hero 3. Um, but I actually didn't. I enjoyed that song and everything, but I actually didn't. Well, fun fact about that song, now that I think about it, is when we first got our iPods, my brother and I, for Brandon in particular, I'm pretty sure Knights of Sidonia was the first song that he ever bought on iTunes. It might actually have been me. It might have been the first song I ever bought on iTunes. Um, but I can't remember which account it was. It was either mine or it was his, but it was literally, you could trace it back at that time, and I don't even have access to it anymore. I'd have to fight like hell with Apple to even try to get access to that account these days. But uh, I know for a fact that on one of those, Knights of Sidonia was the first purchase, which is kind of an interesting fun fact. But even though that was a great song and I enjoyed it, I don't think I really fell in love with Muse until years later, right as I was graduating high school, and they came out with that 2012, kind of like we were talking about with Dead Mouse, this electronica infused album called The Second Law, and they had this song Madness there that I'm sure plenty of people are familiar with. It just kind of had this hypnotic pulse of passion that really clicked with me at that time. But since then, my appreciation for the band has grown significantly as I've gone back and listened to their earlier work in greater detail. But they had their kind of most Radiohead-inspired bouts of paranoia on Origin of Symmetry, and then kind of early 2000s, they had the sort of angst that they had on display in Absolution, which was probably their most famous album or their most commercially successful. But then they had the space age hit making of Black Holes and Revelations, which is what Knights of Sidonia came from in 2006. And all these years later, I think it is that 2006 album, Black Holes and Revelations, that holds up as their greatest triumph, particularly in the first half. I mean, first half of that album is incredible. They line up one of the greatest, maybe even the greatest, three-track runs just ever recorded with Starlight, Supermassive Black Hole, and Map of the Problematique all in a row. Just an unbelievable run, and a great run of incredible albums as well. So, there were titans of the time that whenever I was really getting into music, and I still love listening to this day. Reagan is a huge fan, and so she's definitely enhanced my love of the band over the years. She's actually seen them in concert, which I have not, but yeah, Muse, I gotta give them props, man. Number 25 on this list, they truly have become one of my favorites of all time. Number 24. This is an interesting pick for me. And this is an artist that I like kind of have mixed feelings about in terms of his greater discography, but at his peak, man, he is just unbelievable. And this is Dave Matthews with the Dave Matthews Band. So obviously, I was a child of the '90s, and despite that, it really wasn't until I met Reagan that I finally started to dive in and really understand the incredible creativity and musicianship of the Dave Matthews Band at their peak. Before this, I only knew him for it was impressively soulful and evocative track called "You and Me," which was from their 2008 release "Big Whiskey and the Grugrux King." I think that's how you say that. Anyway, that song was a Grammy nominee during 2010, and it appeared on this Grammy nominee CD I had in my early CD collection, like before I even had an iPod. And so I listened to it a lot because I listened to that CD a lot. I had a limited collection at that time. But that sound of that they captured on that album was so different from just the unbelievably diverse, bold, and frankly at times unhinged direction of their 1998 LP Before These Crowded Streets, which was the album that my wife chose for me to reintroduce them to me all these years later. It was actually until recently, like I didn't even recognize at the time that was the same group that did You and Me that I listened to, all those years ago when I was a kid. Um, I will say before these crowd streets, it does kind of peter out in the second half, which I think is something that you could say for Black Holes and Revelations for Muse as well. But again, like Black Holes and Revelations, the first half of that album is just incredible. It has the animated paranoia of The Last Stop to this like kind of doomsday groove of Don't Drink the Water, which is like an incredible song that really highlights something that you don't often hear about in music. which is the plight of the Native Americans at the hands of the settlers. And then it goes to like this upbeat groove of Stay. And then from that to go to like this violently unhinged song called Halloween. Just an unbridled masterpiece of unpredictable brilliance that I just don't think I've ever heard a single artist match and over the span of just four songs. It's like nothing I've ever heard. I've since gone back and checked out some of their earlier and frankly more commercial work with particularly with Crash from '96, but I much prefer the capriciousness of its follow up and have just been so blown away by it ever since that I cannot help but put Dave Matthews Band this high on the list. Is kind of based on that singular run of just unbalanced triumph. Just an incredible accomplishment that first half of that album is, and it's truly like just a lineup of some of the best songs I've ever heard, and so different, so diverse, so unique, just so well done. Dave Matthews Band, number 24. Number 23. Okay, here we go. Now we're really getting into some controversy. We're in the 90s again. Number 23 is Marilyn Manson. So there's another contender, a few spots higher up on this list that's going to be a contender for like kind of the most controversial figure here. But there's no doubt Marilyn Manson is a top contender, obviously, for most controversial figure on this list. This goes all the way back to 96, the release of the band's Antichrist Superstar and its corresponding Dead to the World tour, which is just kind of a legendary tour because at that time, like the Christian right was just claiming everything horrible was going on during that tour. Like they literally, there were claims of bestiality and satanic rituals and actually even human sacrifice. They literally thought they were sacrificing human beings on that tour. That which is just incredible that people actually thought that. Um, and so that's a little bit more lighthearted these days. I mean, at the time, it was really serious, but just that people were actually taking it serious. But then 3 years later, his music was then falsely and irresponsibly credited for influencing the perpetrators of the infamous Columbine High School shooting tragedy. Um, and so, for that whole period of the mid to late '90s, there were just these exaggerated claims attributed to the band, and its eponymous frontman actually had the same kind of. It's kind of one of those that um, Marilyn Manson is the name of the band. It's also the name of the frontman, and obviously it's not really his name, but that's it's they kind of the same title, so it's kind of gets weird talking about kind of like Bonnie Bear, I guess. Um, but yeah, I'm sure that those exaggerated claims contributed to their status as just a figurehead of youthful rebellion in the '90s. And it was, but really the music itself is what was able to back that up. It was dangerous, it was influential, and it was catchy industrial rock that the band produced over the course of its trilogy of notable releases in the '90s, from Antichrist Superstar through Mechanical Animals and then Hollywood in 2000, that just really added depth to those firestorms. To this day, Hollywood's The Fight Song, I think, stands out as the greatest protest song I've ever heard. It's just an unbelievably bold middle finger to the Christian right. Literally, the hook of the song is "I'm not a slave to a God that doesn't exist." That is the line that he repeats in the chorus of that song. Just so ballsy. Especially in 2000, man, and like all the controversy that he had. I'm just so impressed by that. Um, but then he had Antichrist Superstar with some really incredible music, just like kind of demented and yet irresistibly groovy songs like Mr. Superstar. It's just truly unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. And Marilyn Manson is kind of like Jeremy Soule and some other people that I've mentioned here, where his latest allegation of sexual misconduct at the hands of Evan Rachel Wood appears to be the most damning and actually threatening to his otherwise undisputed status as one of metal's all-time great auteurs. Um, but as an artist, I think he was acquitted or not acquitted, but it ended up being dropped, and there was like a statute of limitations issue. But so that definitely casts a pall over his reputation. But just as an artist with just an unabashed talent of capitalizing on controversy, with a genre-defining sound and the lyrical chops to back it up, I do think that he stands out as one of the all-time greats. And so, that's for that reason I'm putting him here at number 23. I'm like I said in a previous episode, I'm not really factoring in outside controversies. and allegations and things of that nature into it. Because, frankly, a lot of people, a lot of the great artists, particularly older ones from the 70s and whatnot, they did some bad stuff, quite frankly. Um, but I'm just kind of, because of that, it just kind of gets nebulous, like where you draw the line and whatnot. And everybody is free to draw their own lines. But for me in this list, I just wanted to just go with the music and just kind of let everything else fall by the wayside. And so Marilyn Manson's number 23. Number 22, kind of a definitely, I would say Marilyn Manson owes a debt to number 22, as do many artists. Number 22 is Black Sabbath. So with Black Sabbath, I mean, few albums ever released are just as musically influential and significant, and then yet still just incredibly listenable, and just evidently special as Black Sabbath's genre-creating self-titled debut from 1970. Just 5 tracks, depending on how loosely you define the term, because they do combine multiple tracks into individual songs or entries. Just the occult iconography and the heavy sound of that album is often ranked as the single greatest influence on the metal genre. That became obviously one of the true titans of the music industry, particularly in the 80s. But with that said, Black Sabbath's presence and just influence on the industry is undisputed. It stands out to me how simply great their music is all these years later, on top of how influential it was. It's rare for the creator of a genre to stand as its greatest figure, decades later, after so many others followed and built upon their foundations. You go back to rock and roll, and like, you had people like Chuck Berry kind of set the foundation, but some lists do try to put people like Chuck Berry, in the top 100, but I can't subscribe to that. Like those, it's just so much has been built on top of that's so much better, that has come after, but it still, of course, owes a debt to the influence of that thing. To me, like influence and quality are two different metrics. But for Black Sabbath, I mean, they're number one in both categories for metal, and I just think that's unbelievable. And just you look at the lineup of that band. I mean, no metal band can stand up to that lineup. You had Tony Iommi and just his endless bag of iconic riffs. I had bassist Geezer Butler and his iconic just kind of freestyle riffing. Drummer Bill Ward and his unpredictable fills and just this driving jazz-based rhythm. And of course, you have the late Ozzy Osbourne, who is, I mean, objectively one of the biggest figureheads of rock and metal that has ever walked the land. And his approach to songwriting and just kind of paranoid lyricism is not unlike Edgar Allan Poe's influence on the literary world whenever he was on the scene. So you put all those elements together and in harmony and in dissonance, quite frankly, on just some these epic recordings like Wasp Behind the Wall of Sleep, basically NIB from the first album, and then this nearly 15-minute, A Bit of Finger, Sleeping Village Warning. And the result is just magical. But the first album, if that's the band's kind of greatest gift to the musical industry. It's really their 2013 reunion album, which featured such unmitigated metal bangers as God Is Dead and Loner. That to me is their greatest gift to longtime fans that for so many decades hungered for one last run from some of music's truest visionaries. So I just love that they came back and had that one last incredible album in them. And it's interesting listening to or seeing people who are not traditional metal fans like Reagan, my wife, listen to that and just be like, man, this song is awesome. Like she's a huge God Is Dead fan. And so Black Sabbath, like they just have this ability to translate to so many different kinds of people from all walks of life, and just for their influence and the quality of the music that they produced over the course of their time. I gotta give them high props here at number 22. Number 21, rounding out this section of the list, another controversial figure, the other one that I would say would be in competition for Marilyn Manson. Number 21 is Kanye West. And of course, he has a litany of noted collaborators: Rick Ross, Jay Z, Nas, Really Doe, that are kind of highlighted in particular. But, he's really a contender for one of the most controversial figures of my life, quite frankly. He has a rap sheet of public offenses so long, I could probably talk about him here, and I'd talk about him for longer than any other artist that I've discussed throughout these 80 entries that we've talked about so far, before I even got to his accomplishments as an artist. But and through over the course of his career, these controversies have threatened to overshadow his contributions as an artist. pretty much from the beginning with the George Bush doesn't care about black people line, which still kind of makes me laugh to this day. But on through to interrupting Taylor Swift at the VMAs to, whatever's the hell's going on now. It's like this Nazi turn that he's been going through. Clearly he's got some mental issues. But at the same time, few artists have ever walked this earth with the level of influence and just a straight up run of quality albums that Kanye West had, particularly during the first decade of his career, where he released no less than 7 major albums in 10 years. And it's like a unbelievable run. It included The College Dropout, Late Registration, Graduation, 808s and Heartbreak, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, Watch the Throne, and Yeezus. All of those albums are worthy of being considered among the most notable and greatest albums released since the turn of the century, and frankly of all time. And what was really impressive about that run was how diverse it was, from the kind of church-influenced soul of The College Dropout to the orchestrated magistry of Late Registration to the auto-tuned melancholy of 808s and Heartbreak, and then to the maximalist and progressive Dark Twisted Fantasy. I mean, every album was just packed to the gills with hits that were catchy and clever and maybe a little bit unhinged, but to a brilliant degree. And, I've actually been going back and listening to a lot of Kanye, particularly his early days, the early albums lately. And I think what's often forgotten about his early works, particularly The College Dropout, is just how funny he was. From, this detailed and hilarious retelling of his life in Last Call to putting a spotlight on just the lunacy of societal expectations and the college experience and equal measures on the new workout plan at School Spirit. But, he did lose that lightheartedness in his later works. But he also perfected his ability to stir emotion on tracks like Roses and Pinocchio Story and Runaway. Even under all the glitz and glamour of his impeccable production, which is laudable as well, I think that ability to just stir emotion was really his greatest enduring strength and why he connected with so many people. I think for me, Kanye's musical imprint on my life, I mean, there was a time where he would have probably been my number one artist, particularly when I was in college. I mean, he's so relatable to people that are going through the college experience, and for sure for me at that time, while he was still kind of at his peak. I mean, Yeezus came out. He was still a little bit past his peak, but Yeezus came out when I was, both Yeezus and Life of Pablo, actually. Life of Pablo came out like right whenever I was getting ready to graduate college, and Yeezus came out during my sophomore year. No, I guess it was my freshman year. But kind of had those 2 bookends to my time in college, and of course I just got so into all of his music. And actually, there's kind of this running joke in the East Texan, my school paper at the time that I was the editor of. I would put all these like Kanye references in there just for fun. People would try to pick them out, but so his musical imprint on my life, and I suspect on the lives of millions of others, kind of makes it almost impossible for his antics to sort of outweigh his contributions. But I do think that they will threaten to blunt the reach of his legacy as an artist and as a true pioneer of the musical landscape of the 21st century, which is a real shame. But, for this list, Kanye West taking number 21. And, quite frankly, like I said, he would have been higher. And maybe I'm being influenced a little bit by some of the outside stuff. And, of course, the huge negative turn that his career has taken since all that, kind of this last decade. But, like I said, he was so important to me while he was at his peak, and for that reason, I do still have him rank him very highly here at number 21 on this list. So, but that's it for this section of the list. Number 20, we've done number 100 through 21. So next time we circle back on this, we will wrap up the series with my ultimate top 20 artists of all time. I hope you're looking forward to that. And if you've listened to the series up to this point, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you want to write in about your own favorite artists or give me feedback or thoughts on some of my picks, my criteria. I know I had some controversial ones here today. You can write into the show at ControlledBurnes with an ES at gmail.com. And don't forget, if you like the show, you can subscribe, follow, like, and review wherever you listen to your podcast. But for now and until next time, keep it warm.